everybody, Carol from Segovia Quilts here. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to join 4 quadrants of a collage style quilt. So let's get started. So here are the 4 pieces of the quilt top that we're going to be putting together today. So I kind of left them with gaps between each piece. So this one right here is one piece. This here is another piece, and then up here we've got the 3rd piece and the 4th piece. So they're pretty good sized pieces. This block right here with the whales on it, this is 20 inches. So we've got 20 inches, the little bush gardens is 4 inches. This orange block is 12, 4, and 12. This is a pretty good sized chunk of the quilt. This size, or this part over here, is the smallest section, but I wanted to make sure that I had different sized quadrants so that I could show you all how to go about putting them together. So let me go ahead and get closer to these 2 sections here, and I'll go ahead and start explaining to you all how I do it. So this is obviously the top part up here, and then what I'm kneeling on here is the bottom part, and this is the whole left side of the quilt if we're looking at it, which we are. So these are the gaps that we have. So right here is one straight seam that we would sew, and then we'll have to join this gray block to the top piece of this pink one, and then we have this straight seam right here. But as you can tell, this bottom section here is not as wide as this top section here. So this is actually going to be joined with this section here, and then those 2 blocks here would finish off this seam right here. So you can kind of see like a puzzle piece. So if I move this up a little bit, you can see this gray block and the blue one will fit perfectly right here between the black and the maroon one, and then the orange block here will come up along the side, and then it just keeps going from there. So a lot of you all had questions on, well, how do I join the quadrants? So there's not necessarily a right or a wrong way to do it. Now there are some things that you have to do first before you can move on to another step. For example, if we were to try and join this gray block here to the top of this pink one, you can't. And the way I like to think of it is, if you have to sew over a seam, you have to make sure that seam that you're going to sew over has already been sewn together before you continue on. So here's what I mean. This block here would join to the top of this block here, and then these 2 would join to this pink one right here. So if I was to try and attach this gray one to the top of the pink one first, let's see if we have any other seams that would be interfering. So obviously right away there's a seam right here that we would have to sew over to sew these 2 together. So we can't join this gray one to this pink one until we first take care of the seams that we would have to sew over, which would be this seam up here and then this seam right here, because we would have to sew straight down. Well, we're going to be sewing over a seam. So okay, so you need to take care of that seam first. So what we would do is first we would join the gray and the black block together, and we would sew down, and obviously we're going to have to keep joining, so we would just sew down to say right here, we would backstitch and then cut our threads. So that seam would be done. So then, okay, let's see if we sew up this seam. Okay, we're going to run into another seam. So we have to make sure that we sew this seam first. So we would do the white block to the top of this pink one. We would sew all the way across. We're sewing over a seam, but this seam has already been completed. Keep going, we're sewing over another seam. Again, this one is done. And then we would keep going all the way to the end, and that would be the end of our seam. So let's say this seam is done, and this seam is done. So now we would have one seam left, and all the other seams in there have already been sewn together and they're already done. So then we could go ahead and finish up this seam right here. So a couple of you all had asked, well, which order do I sew all of my quadrants together in? And honestly, you don't have to sew them in any particular order. You could sew the 2 top halves together first, and then you could sew the 2 bottom halves together, or you could sew the 2 right pieces together first, and then sew the 2 left pieces together, and then join them down the middle. Honestly, you can do it however way you prefer to do it. For today's video, I'm just going to work by sewing my 2 top pieces together and my 2 bottom pieces together, and then I'm going to connect them. Alright, so since I'm going to be sewing my 2 top halves together first, I need to figure out what seams I need to sew first. So we'll just start right at the top, and I'm just going to line these up. So now if I started up here, I would sew down this seam right here, and then I would end up meeting with this block. But I can't finish this seam right here because I'm going to be sewing over another seam during this seam. So, okay, so then we move on to this one. Okay, so let's say I sew this together first. So I would start here and I would come this way, but in order to complete this seam, I have to sew over this seam. Obviously it's not been done yet, so now we move on to this seam. Alright, so now let's see, I start at the top, I sew all the way down, and I will have to stop short because I will have to do another seam here afterwards, but there isn't a seam between here and here that I would be sewing over that hasn't yet been completed. So we would sew over this seam, but it's done. We would sew over this seam, but it's done. And then we would sew over this seam, but it's also already done. So this line here is where we would start sewing first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this piece and I'm going to flip it on top so I can line it up. So I'm just going to pull this aside, and I'm just going to do a rough line up here, just so I have a good idea of where everything is going to lay, and make sure it's all nice and flat. Alright, so that's looking pretty good. And then down here at the bottom, you can see this part here doesn't go all the way to the end, which we knew it wouldn't because it's going to be lining up with this orange block here. So right here, I know that I've got 4 and probably 1/4 inch right here, and that's what this block measures right here. So we're good there. So now we can take this over to the sewing machine and go ahead and sew down this seam right here. So let's go ahead and do that. Alright, so we're ready to go ahead and start sewing our seam. So I'm going to realign it. Now this is where we do our precision lining up. Alright, so we're good there. Putting it under our presser foot. And we'll go ahead and start sewing. You don't have to do a back stitch here. You can if you want. I don't, but it's completely up to you. Alright, there we go. And I am doing a 1/4 inch seam. So I sewed a couple of inches and now I'm realigning the rest. And I am about to sew over a seam, so I do want to make sure that my seam is laying exactly how I want it. And it is, so we're good there. Right, so we're coming up to the end of our top block here, or the top portion of our quilt. So again, we can't finish this seam because we still have to attach another block right here. So I'm going to sew maybe about another inch or 2. That's good. And then I'm going to do a back stitch. There. Alright, so we're going to cut our threads. Now let's go ahead and lay our quilt top back out. Alright. So this right here is the seam that we just did over at the sewing machine. And you can see my Scooby-Doo block over here is still loose, as well as my pink block and the rest of these blocks up here. They're still loose. So now we need to go ahead and sew our next seam. Now if we line everything up, okay, so we'll go ahead and start at the top. Again, we'll be sewing down the seam, but we still have this seam first to deal with. So we go ahead and move down here. So this right here will be the next seam that we need to do. So when you just lay it out, it lines up perfectly with the end of this little black block right here. Alright, so now we can go ahead and fold this down. And then this is just a short little seam. This is maybe 5-6 inches right here that we need to sew. So what we'll do is we'll just go ahead and line it up. And this part we can just fold over, and to save a little bit of bulk, we'll just kind of roll it up like this. There. So then this is where we need to sew. We need to start here, or you can even start over here depending on how you want to put it in your sewing machine. So you would go from here to here, and then you can do, again, a locking stitch if you choose. I probably won't, but let's go ahead and get this sewn by heading over to the sewing machine. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start my seam. Instead of from the end, I'm going to start it up here where I already have a locking stitch from where I stopped before. So I'm just going to go ahead and realign that. I'm going to put this section under my presser foot here. There we go. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and start my seam first by making sure I do another locking stitch. Alright, so now we can go ahead and realign the rest of our block here. We got a couple of little tail threads here, so I'm just going to pull those out, make sure they're tight. Then I'm going to tuck them right under here because I'm going to sew right over this little section here. Alright, so we're good there. Let's go ahead and finish our seam. There we go. We'll go ahead and cut our threads. Now let's go ahead and lay this back out. So this right here is the section that we just sewed. I believe it was from right about here to here. So that seam is done. We are good to go there. So then we would move on to our next seam, which is also our last seam for this top section of the quilt. And again, we would start right down here because this is where we had stopped previously. So I would start down here and I would just sew all along here until the very end. And I do like to do locking stitches on my ending seams, especially if I'm not going to be having a border attached. So I like to do a locking stitch just because when I'm moving the quilt around to put it on my quilt frame or getting it ready to go, some of these outside blocks can come apart, and depending on how much it comes apart, I might have to go back in and fix it before I can actually get to the quilting part. So I will do a locking stitch at the very end once I get here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and lay this back on top so I can get this seam nice and lined up. So that's good for a rough little lining up first. So now let's go ahead and take this over to the sewing machine. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put this section of my quilt back under the presser foot. So I can go ahead and start off by doing another locking stitch. So let's do that. Alright, so now I can go ahead and make sure the rest of my two pieces here are lined up. There we go. Alright. Okay, so I'm about to sew over this seam here. So I'm checking to see which direction I want it to lay. So I want it to lay this way. So let's go ahead and sew over that. I'm going slowly to make sure I catch both sides of that seam on the side that I want it. I've got another seam coming up, so I'm figuring out which direction I want that one to lay. Alright, so I want it to lay towards me. So let's go ahead and keep going. Okay, we've got the last 8 inches here. I'm just lining up the very end over here. Alright. And now I'm just going to go ahead and do a back stitch. One more. There we go. Okay. Perfect. So let's go ahead and lay this back out. So this was the last seam that we just did. It started right about here and it went to the end, so we did this seam, but before that we had sewn this seam, but before that we had sewn this seam all the way down to the just about the very end. So now our two top pieces have been joined together. So quadrant 1 and 2 are done. So now we can move on to quadrant 3 and 4. So we have quadrant 3 and 4 laid out and ready to start figuring out what we're going to sew together first. So as I mentioned earlier in the video, I am going to go ahead and sew the two bottom pieces together first, and then I will attach them to the top section of our quilt. So let's go ahead and start looking at our blocks right in here. Go ahead and zoom in a little bit. There we go. Alright, so let's figure out where we need to sew first. Now this one is actually going to be pretty much exactly the same as the one that we just did. So we've got a seam right here, we have a seam right here, and then we have a seam right here. So now if we did this seam first, let's see if we're able to go throughout the entire section before coming across another seam. Alright, so yes, we can do this entire seam here without sewing over another seam that hasn't been completed yet. So in this whole stretch right here, we only have one seam that we're going to sew over, and that is right here. Right? So we could start with this seam if we wanted. Let's go ahead and look at the bottom and see if that one is the same or if it's different. So if we started up here and sewed all the way down to the bottom, we would be crossing over two seams. Let me bring that up a little bit. We would be sewing over two seams, and that's this seam right here and this seam right here, but they actually will line up when we join our blocks. So it'll kind of be like sewing over one seam. So we'll stretch this back out. But if we started here and went all the way down, we are not crossing over any seams that haven't been completed yet. So we could sew this whole seam without having to worry about stopping in the middle or slightly before the end. And then our only other remaining seam would be right here. So now this part that's going to join the pink to the brown, this seam we cannot do because if we started here and sewed this way, we would be sewing over a seam that hasn't been done yet. And same thing over here. We can't do this seam right here without first completing this seam right here between these two blocks. So now we know where we need to start sewing first. We can actually sew this seam and this seam together at the sewing machine to save us time from having to sew one seam, come back and lay it out, and then sew the other one. Now you don't have to do both at the same time. If you prefer to sew one seam, lay it back out, and then line up for your second one, that is perfectly fine. But I'm going to go ahead and sew both at the same time. So to do that, I'm going to take this and lay it on top right here. And I will go ahead and get out some of my Wonder Clips and go ahead and clip these. So let's do that. Alright, so I'm just going to clip, we'll move this out of the way a little bit. We'll go ahead and clip right here. And we'll go ahead and clip right here. And these are just rough. I'm not lining it up perfectly just yet. I will do that over at the sewing machine. And we'll go ahead and put one right here. So now, let's go ahead and line up our bottom section. Go ahead and put a clip right here. We'll put one at the bottom. There we go. And then we'll go ahead and put one in the middle. And again, this is just a rough lining up. I'll go ahead and adjust it when I get back to the sewing machine. There, so these are the two seams that we're going to sew. This is our top one, and then this is our bottom. It will be a little wonky because they're obviously not lining up the way they will once we finish all 3 seams. But don't worry about it, so long as you're able to get what you're going to sew nice and straight, you won't have a problem at all. So let's go ahead and get both of these seams sewn together. Alright, so now as far as which seam to actually sew first, it doesn't really matter, honestly. I'm picking the one that was closest to my presser foot when I laid this out on my table. So you can sew whichever one you want to first. There isn't a right or a wrong one to do first. So I took off my Wonder Clip and I'm just realigning this. Now this brown square here, this is a sweatshirt or like a hoodie material, so it is a little bit thicker. So I'm just making sure to be extra careful with that to make sure it's lined up because it could move around a little bit on me. Right, so we're good there. Okay, I'm just sewing a couple of stitches and then I'm going to adjust the rest of my block. And I'm just reaching underneath under here with my left hand so I can kind of move it around as I need to. Alright. Okay, we're coming up to our second Wonder Clip. And I am readjusting as I'm going because again, our 2 little quadrants were a little wonky because of our seams being in 2 different places. Alright, so I'm coming up to my 2 seams that I have to go over. I'm actually sewing, this is the bottom section here. So these are the 2 seams that we're going to be sewing over. So because they are supposed to line up, I'm going to go ahead and take this time now to make sure that they're going to line up perfectly. And I'm going to go ahead and put a Wonder Clip on them. Alright, so let's go ahead and sew over this seam. Now this is a pretty bulky seam. There. Alright. And this is an ending seam, so I am going to go ahead and do a back stitch. There we go. Perfect. Alright, so we're done here, so let's go ahead and sew our second one. I'm just rearranging my 2 pieces here. Pull my threads to the back. Alright, so we'll move this clip. Let's go ahead and line this up. This is the top of our top seam. Sew over that seam. We're almost to the end, so I'm going to go ahead and take off my last Wonder Clip. I'm going to go ahead and line up the bottom of my 2 blocks here. There we go. There. Alright, so let's go ahead and lay this back out. So, now it might be hard to tell where our seams were, but right here is one of our seams, and then right here is the second seam. So now the other seam that we still need to close up is right here. Now we couldn't do this because we still had to do both of these seams before we could sew over that section. So now this is the last seam that we have to worry about for this bottom half. So I'm going to go ahead and fold it over, and it'll lay nicely. There. Alright, so now we just need to sew from here to here, and this section will be done. So let's go ahead and do that. Alright, so let's go ahead and put the top of our seam under a presser foot, so we can go ahead and do a locking stitch. There we go. So now I'm just going to readjust everything and make sure everything's nice and lined up. And I'm pulling on these bottom threads here just to make sure they're nice and tight, and then I'm just going to tuck them under the seam. And that seam can pretty much go any direction that I like, but it looks like it's wanting to come towards me because this brown fabric here is part of our hoodie fabric, so it's thicker than this orange fabric, so I'm just going to go ahead and let it lay the direction that it wants to lay. Alright. And this seam, I'm just going to go ahead and push it away from me. So let's go ahead and sew over that one. There we go. And then I'm just realigning this pink block here, making sure that sits nicely. Alright. Okay, so I've got a seam going under my needle right now. And I've completed the seam, so now I'm going to go ahead and do a locking stitch. There we go. Alright, so let's go ahead and lay this back out. So right here is the seam that we just sewed, from here to about here. So that is all nice and closed up. So we'll just straighten this out a little bit more. This seam right here and this seam right here were the two seams that we sewed together, and then we finished up with that seam right there. Alright, so now the last steps are for us to join the bottom half to the top half. So let's go ahead and walk through the seams that we're going to have to do. So there's going to be a seam connecting these two pieces, which is right here. And then we've got a seam that's going to come down here, and then right across this section. And then we'll have a seam right here, and then the last one right here. So now looking at this, I can already kind of tell which seams I'm going to be able to do completely and which ones I'm not. So this seam right here I can do. I can start it right here, sew over this seam which is completed, sew over this seam which is also completed, and then finish it up right here on the end. That one I can do no problem. And then same thing for the seam on this side. So I can start it right here, sew over this seam right here which is completed, sew over this seam which is also completed, and then I can finish it up right here. So this is one seam that I can go ahead and sew, no problem. So this seam here is our next longest one. So now this one, it looks like we could sew it together no problem too, but that's not the case. And the reason is because right here we would start the seam, we would sew right here, sew over this seam which is completed, sew over this seam which is also completed, and we would keep coming, but there's another seam that we have to worry about, and it's right here. And it's actually going to join this block to this block. So because of that seam right there, we cannot sew this whole seam right here. It looks like it at first, but that's not the case. So what we would have to do before sewing this seam here is actually do this seam which connects these two blocks right here. So we would have to sew here first before we could do this section right here. And again, it's because we would have to sew over a seam that hasn't been completed yet. So we have to do that one first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and sew both of these side seams together. So to do that, I'm going to start by bringing this bottom section here and laying it on top of the top section. So let's get some wonder clips. So we're going to go ahead and clip these sections together. Just going to use probably 3 clips is going to be sufficient. It's just enough to keep it together until I get to the sewing machine, and then I can readjust everything. Alright, so let's go ahead and take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew both sides at the same time. Okay, so just like last time, I'm starting with the seam that landed closest to my sewing foot. So it doesn't really necessarily matter which one you do first, you have to do them both. So whichever one is closest or easiest to start with, go ahead and do that. And this is an outside seam, so I am going to backstitch to keep that secured. Alright. And now this is where I'm doing my more precision lining up of my 2 blocks. And I'm adjusting it as I sew. And because we have a lot of bulk right here, you want to make sure you're looking underneath what you're sewing to make sure you don't potentially have another piece of the quilt kind of tucking under And, you know, if you don't notice it, that's something that you would end up potentially sewing to this seam, and then you're going to have to go out and or go back and rip some stitches, and that wouldn't be fun. Alright, so I have a seam coming up here, and I'm just giving my threads a little tug to make sure it's nice and tight before I sew over it. And also still lining up my blocks. Alright. And when I sew over seams, I generally let the seam go in whatever direction it wants to go. Because if I try and fight it to go in a direction that it's not naturally laying, it could potentially end up being like a lump in the quilt later on. So I let it go whichever direction it wants to go. Alright, so now this one, so what I would normally do for this seam here is I would want it to lay away, but there is a seam right here from the shirt, just a little bit of it still left, that is thicker, which is pushing this bottom half towards me. So what I'm going to end up doing is when I go over and I press all of this, I'm going to press this seam, this top part that way, and the bottom part towards me. And so like right here, you can either snip it with your scissors to let it lay a little bit flatter, or you could just squish it down with the iron and however it ends up getting pressed like that. It's up to you. So that's why it looks a little wonky, because you're thinking, well, which direction is that seam wanting to lay? It's kind of wanting to lay both directions. Alright, so we're coming to the end of this seam right here. Got a few more inches. We're going to take off our Wonder Clip and we'll finish up this seam. There we go. And I don't need to do a locking stitch here because this is an internal stitch and it's going to get stitched over here in a couple of minutes anyways. Alright, so now we need to move along the quilt and get to our next seam, which isn't too far. It was only, I believe, 12 or 16 inches away. So we got it right here. So we're going to take off this little clip and lay this out and start lining it up properly. There we go. So let's go ahead and take a couple of stitches. There. And again, this part right here is not an outside seam, so I'm not going to worry about back stitching. Okay. So we've come to the end, and this part right here is an outside seam, so we are going to backstitch when we get to the end. Alright, so let's go ahead and lay out our quilt so we can see the section that we just sewed together. So now already you can see the big gaping hole where we still have to sew it. Don't worry, it's supposed to be there. Alright, so we'll just kind of straighten it out a little bit so you can see what we're working with. So, the two seams that we just did, this is the first one right here. So that one is done, it is finished. And this is the second one right here. This one is also done and finished. So now, we still have 3 seams left to do. We have this seam right here, that's one. Our third seam is right here, or excuse me, our second seam is right here, and our third seam is right here. So now, what we need to do is we need to figure out which seam needs to go first. So if we start over here, this seam right here we cannot finish because there's a seam that is unfinished that we would have to sew over. So we can't do this one first. So let's look at this one. This one goes over 2 completed seams, but it has to go over a seam that is also currently not finished. So we can't do that one first. So that leaves this seam right here. So now I'm just going to pull this over so I can show you. So this seam right here starts in here and it ends right down here on the orange block here. So now this one, we can actually go ahead and start and finish this seam. So this seam right here is the next one that we need to do before we can do the other two seams. So to do that, we'll just go ahead and fold this part over on top. And then we can just line it up and then go ahead and sew this seam. So let's go ahead and go back to the sewing machine and take care of this. This is only about 5 inches, 6 inches or so of a seam, so it shouldn't take us very long. But let's go ahead and sew this seam. Okay, so let's go ahead and put this seam under a presser foot and go ahead and get our locking stitch taken care of. There you go. So now we're just going to align these two blocks here. And it will be a little wonky because it's in the middle of our quilt, so we have all of this quilt bulk to deal with. So we'll just line up the two bottom parts, and then we'll go ahead and line up this part and make sure our seam is laying in the proper direction. And I want it to go away from me. There we go. Alright, so let's go ahead and lay this back out. Alright, so this seam right here is what we just did at the sewing machine. Got some threads poking out there, but no big deal. Alright, so we've got this one done. So our next seam that we're going to do is going to be this one. So this one, we can actually start it here. We'll sew over 1 finished seam, 2 finished seams, 3 finished seams, and we'll be able to finish it up right here. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this part back over on top. There we go. Now this one, I don't necessarily need to use any wonder clips. It's pretty straightforward. Alright, so I'm going to start right here and I'm going to sew all the way to the end. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so let's go ahead and put our seam right here under the presser foot and go ahead and take care of our locking stitch. Alright, so now we can go ahead and adjust our blocks here. Make sure they're all nice and lined up. And I've got a seam right here that I'm going to be sewing under. And I'm going to go ahead and have it facing me or pointing towards me. So over that seam. And now we've got all the quilt bulk to contend with, so it can get a little tricky. Okay, so we've got a seam coming up, so I'm just going to tug on those threads, make sure they're nice and tight, and then we'll just tuck them along this seam right here. I'm going to go ahead and have the seam facing me. Okay, we've got a seam on the bottom. Same thing, I'm going to tug my threads and then tuck them alongside the seam. And I'm going to go ahead and have the seam facing away from me. That seems to be the direction it wants to go. Okay, we're coming up to the end here. So I'm just going to go ahead and line up my two ends. Okay, we've got a little bit of slack on our top block, so we're just going to make sure to ease it in a little bit. And that'll take care of any puckering that could potentially come. And I'm just holding it as I'm sewing. This way that little bit of slack will get taken up as we're sewing the seam here. And it wasn't much. I would say it was maybe 1/8 of an inch of slack if I had to guess. And that happens from time to time depending on what kind of fabric you're working with, or if you tugged on a block a little too much, something like that, and maybe got it a little distorted. There we go. Alright, so let's go ahead and go lay this out. So the seam that we just did started right about here, and it came all the way down, and it finished right here. So this seam is now done. We sewed over 1, 2, 3 finished seams as we did this one. So now our last seam for the entire quilt top is right here. And it starts right here and it ends right in here. So now all we have to do is lay this over. And I do have some threads that were poking in there, so I'm just going to reach in and pull those out first. So now we just lay this together and we sew from here to here, and that'll finish our last seam. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so let's go ahead and put this part of the seam under our presser foot and do our locking stitch. Alright. So now in this seam, we are going to sew over 2 seams that will be meeting up. So after I get through a couple of inches, I'm going to go ahead and make sure those seams will meet up nicely. Just going to give these 2 little threads a tug, and then we'll go ahead and line that up. I'm going to go ahead and try and pull out all of these little threads from our seams that are nearby, just to keep them from being inside the quilt, and then I'm going to have to end up worrying about snipping them off later. Alright, so that's good. Okay, so we're coming up to the 2 seams where our blocks are going to meet, so we need to make sure that those are crisp little intersections. So I'm pulling out all these little threads here, and I'm going to make sure my seams lock. And to do that, you want, so my bottom seams are facing me and my top seams are facing away. And by doing that, it's going to allow the black block and the pink block to lie up nicely. They're going to butt together nicely, and it's going to give us that nice crisp point. So those are perfectly nested, so let's go ahead and sew over that. Right. And then the end of our seam is right here, so we are just about done. Alright, so let's do a locking stitch, and there we have it. So let's go ahead and take this out and lay the quilt top back out. Alright. So the seam that we just did was right here. And the 2 seams where our blocks met is right here, and that is a beautiful point right there. So it came together nicely. Okay, so here's the finished product of sewing all 4 of our quadrants together. So all of our seams have been taken care of. Everything is joined nicely. So all 4 of our quadrants have been put together. Our quilt top is now done, and it's ready for me to go ahead and load it onto my quilt frame and start quilting it together. This is a queen size quilt. So the last step I need to do now is I need to press all of my seams. When I'm piecing everything together, I generally don't press any of my seams. I might finger press a couple of them when I have to sew over them, but I don't press any of my seams while I'm doing it because I would rather get everything put together, and then I'll press the whole thing at the same time before I load it onto my quilt frame. So that's how you join the 4 quadrants for your quilt top in the collage style quilt. So that's it for today's video. Hopefully the instructions that I provided will help you to be able to join the 4 quadrants of your collage style quilt top together too. Even though in my video I joined the 2 top pieces first and then the 2 bottom pieces and then join those together, you can do it by joining the 2 side pieces first and then putting those together. There's really no right or wrong way or any particular order that you have to do it, and you can do it however you prefer. And honestly, you could even do it going clockwise or counterclockwise. It doesn't matter. Whichever direction you want to go, whatever works best for you, do that. What I showed you in the video was just how I decided to do it for this particular quilt. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them in the comment section located just down below. If you liked what you saw in today's video, make sure to hit it with a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber to my YouTube channel yet, please make sure you do so by hitting the subscribe button. Thank you for watching, and until next time, happy quilting!